join me in welcoming Michael Terpin to Startup Grind Toronto. First of all, thank you for coming. I mean, Michael's originally from Buffalo and has been, all over the place as part of his regular business, but also as part of evangelizing BitAngels. And so we're kind of catching him between LA and New York, we persuaded him to spend some time with family in Buffalo as part of this trip. So we appreciate that, and especially making that trip to Waterloo today. We're grateful for that. But first, so we want to go to Buffalo and go to high school or university, or go back and find out where was it that you started? Were you one of these people selling ice cubes and at the end of your driveway, or Kool-Aid, or when did you first get the entrepreneurial spark?
Like a lot of entrepreneurs, very early. I was a coin collector, and I was also a writer very early. So I put the two together, and I sold my first magazine article when I was 11. And it was actually about coin collecting. And getting a check for $5 for something I wrote was just very inspiring, both for my future journalism career as well as for my future entrepreneurial career.
So you went to school in Syracuse?
I went to school in Syracuse. New York has, I'm a big fan, by the way, of what Canada does in terms of having the government actually participate in what I think government should do, which is to take people who grow up, poor, lower middle class like I did, and give them opportunities and just show them things they can do. I mean, I basically was only able to get into Syracuse because I got a fellowship that was based on my grades and also based on New York State Regents exam, where if you got a certain grade point average and passed a certain test, you could then go, and they kept you inside of New York. That's why I went to Syracuse. And it turned out Syracuse was the top journalism school in the country, so it was my first choice anyway. But otherwise, if New York didn't do that, I might have been saying, yeah, kind of cold here. Maybe I should get to California and go to UCLA or something.
So I guess we're going to be looking for that period between university and MarketWire.
Sure. Long period.
Yeah, and or what we're sort of maybe connect the dots.
Okay.
To MarketWire, and maybe talk a little bit about how MarketWire got started.
Sure. So I basically went to Syracuse because I knew that I was a writer, and I really hadn't thought about what to do entrepreneurially yet. I was just thinking, how do you make a living without staying in Buffalo and working for a factory like most of my family and extended family did. I thought writing was sort of my way out of the factories, and so I really was just looking to write for a magazine perhaps or something, write for a newspaper. And worked for the school paper, and then went to Syracuse. And it's funny because Syracuse is the top public relations school in the country, and that's what I've done for a good chunk of my career. Never took a single PR class. I just took journalism classes and magazine classes. And I graduated in 3 years for sort of entrepreneurial cost-saving startup reasons. I figured out that the way that my scholarship worked, and I don't know if they still do it these days, but they gave you a full ride the first 2 years, then they gave you half of your tuition the third year, and you were on your own the last year. And I'm thinking, okay, that's kind of because they figure by then they have you, and you're going to figure some way of affording it. And so I did the math and just, didn't think on work, study, $4 an hour wages or whatever they were back then, I'd be able to afford my final year. So I figured out how to go and get 2 majors in 3 years by transferring state school credits into Syracuse and working during and instead of working during the summers, I figured it was actually more economical to go to school at SUNY Buffalo during the summers, and so I graduated in 3 years with 2 degrees to save money. So that was being entrepreneurial at a young age.
So that's a hustler.
That's the hustler thing, yeah. It's the hustler versus the hacker. Then I also figured I would add 1 year to my sort of productive business life by getting out and working at 21. So my first job was a reporter at the Watertown, New York Daily Times. They sort of hired a lot of alumni from from Syracuse, and had a job as the Potsdam, New York bureau chief, chasing a lot of fire engines and going to different, just it's tough work, but it's interesting that even though Syracuse, I think, is still to this day, one of the more, the least academic of the journalism schools, I've always been sort of like, the academics, the ones with the PhDs, always say, well, we want you to learn the theory of this and the theory of that, and it's all nice to have one or two of those classes, but really, when you go out into the workplace, you better know how to be able to, write a story, go and edit, this and that. And so I learned more, I would say, in my first 2 months on the job than I did in my entire time at Syracuse, although I will credit they had one feature writing course where to pass the course, you had to sell one of your stories.
Ah, that's great.
And I think more schools should do that. I mean, and I got an A. I sold a story about what I kind of knew, which was one of my other passions at the time, playing chess. So I was a championship chess player in high school, and I was Syracuse University champ. And I knew this young kid who played in some of the local tournaments in Syracuse called Jonathan Tisdall, who at age 13 was New York State champion. He was the youngest since Bobby Fischer to be New York State champion. And so I just thought he was an interesting feature story. So I went to his home, took pictures, wrote the feature story, and I sold it to the Syracuse New Times. I think they maybe paid me $20. It was an upgrade for my $5 for the coin article, but that was a good experience and kind of hustling, and that a taste of the real world that you have to go out there and sort of do that sort of thing. And then I went after chasing fire trucks at the Watertown Daily Times for about a year and a half. I really decided it was a tough life for $9,000 a year, or whatever my salary was at that point. Most small town papers, they just kind of burn you out, give you a good education in the business, then you do your next thing and they collect the next class of graduates. So while I was looking at where to go, I was really hoping to work for a magazine, and I found out that by then, magazines had already started to become rather entrepreneurial in that they would hire full-time editors, but they would actually buy piecemeal articles and pay by the word, because it was cheaper that way and they didn't have to pay benefits. And so I saw that most writers for magazines, this is still pretty much true today, are either contributed or they're people who don't really need to work for a living. They're sort of, second career, or they do that on the side, or whatever. And it's hard to make a living as a full-time magazine writer, especially when you're like 22 years old.
Right.
And so someone had suggested that I apply for a position in public relations at Clarkson University, and I never thought of PR. And I sort of looked and said, pays better, has 5 weeks paid vacation because it's a university, which to me was just amazing, because I think I had 1 week vacation at the other place. And it seemed like more money for less work. And it would also be that I would get to actually write more creative stories. And I really knew nothing about PR, and turned out that I was good at it, and I spent a good chunk of the rest of my career in that field. So that was sort of getting into PR. Starting my own company was then getting into more entrepreneurialism, and that was basically, was at Clarkson for a couple of years, decided to go back and get my master's degree. Did the same kind of bootstrapping hustlerism, where I found that when I was at Clarkson, one of the benefits was you got free courses at any Central New York college, and they had a good creative writing program at SUNY Potsdam. So I would take free courses in creative writing, and so I got to the point that I could get my master's degree in 2 semesters, and then I went to SUNY Buffalo to get my master's degree, which had a top writing school, MFA program. And at that point I was 25, and really not sure whether I wanted to go into being a full-time writer with the Great American Novel, and I also won some awards in poetry, which is like, you really want to start, be a poet. A bestseller is 5,000 copies. And so you basically have to teach, right? I mean, that's what most poets do, is they teach. And these days they can do some performance art and things like that, but I wasn't really, I didn't throw tomatoes at the wall, I just sort of, did more traditional poetry readings. And so I got an offer for the Gray Chair Fellowship at SUNY Buffalo to get my PhD, because I got my master's with the idea that you could teach with that, and then they said, well, it's a bad economy, you really need a PhD and a master's degree. unless you like won the Yale Younger Poets Award, then you're fine, but you don't even need the master's degree to do that, so. So I'm trying to decide, do I get my PhD and spend like another few cold years in Buffalo, even though the Great Chair Fellowship, I don't think anybody else had ever turned it down before. It was very prestigious. It was working with Robert Creeley, who was one of the top poets in America when he was alive, and basically just bringing famous poets to campus. And that sort of like cemented your networking for life in that world. Or I basically just sent out a couple of like, you know, cold call letters to ads for PR at universities in warm places. So I did one in Florida and I did one in California. And the University of Redlands liked my application, flew me out, gave me the job. And I had to go and talk to Bob Creeley and see whether I should go and, you know, get my PhD and have a life of letters, or go and continue my career in PR. And I'm sitting there and listening to someone in front of me waiting, and it was somebody who had gotten his PhD after getting his master's, and he was unemployed for 4 years driving a cab, and he finally had gotten a job as an assistant professor at East Oklahoma State, and he was taking his wife and 4 kids and driving across to like Enid, Oklahoma or something to be able to make $13,000 a year. And as I'm listening to that, my decision was made, and instead of having a heart-to-heart conversation, I just went up and said, "Bob, I'm moving to California." And that's how I got to the West Coast, and that's how I got to be head of PR at the University of Redlands, where I started becoming a little bit entrepreneurial, because in California, unlike New York, a lot of the professors would approach me and say, "Hey, you know, I have a startup company. Right. Can you do a little bit of PR for me on the side?" And I did that, and then I got enough of that I basically just gave up that job and started sort of the first version of my first agency, which for those people who are sort of considering starting companies, I did everything wrong with my first startup. First of all, I basically decided to keep costs low, and at least in the agency world, you want to keep your overhead at least looking high enough to justify your fees. So by working on my home, they're thinking, well, how high can their overhead be? I'm going to pay them like the lowest I can possibly think of. And you know, when I did it right the next time, I got fancy offices and I got them cheap, and I was able to charge 5 times as much for the same work. And PR really got me then into I hung my shingle up for my own company, and I then, after that one didn't work out, I actually went and ran the PR division for an ad agency and sort of learned a little bit of best practices working for another place. How to go and pitch business properly, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I probably would have stayed there longer, but the 2 partners split up, and the rainmaker left and the artist stayed. And surprise, sales went down. And the artist basically, I knew when I was the one bringing in most of the business, and I'm looking at them to bring me business, that was bad sign number 1. Bad sign number final was when I went in on a Friday afternoon to pick up a check or something, and they had the entire art department doing lines of cocaine on their desks. And I'm thinking, I don't know if this is a real serious enterprise, so I decided to put my shingle up and just started with no clients. And the guy who was the businessman left and went to work for Fujitsu. And about a week after I was in business, he called and said, "So I need a PR firm. I'm at Fujitsu." And that was my first account. And then, okay, MarketWire. So MarketWire, so that was my first PR agency, the Terpin Group. That was from 1990, I started it, and I sold that in 2000, right around the same time that I got my Sequoia money in, because I didn't want to be like running 2 companies at the same time. So Sequoia money came into Terpin? No, or came into a spin-off company. So oh, okay, right. I incubated what was originally called GINA, the Global Internet News Agency. Okay. Out of my PR firm, and I had several different ideas for doing things that would incorporate the internet into PR. All of which actually have been ideas that have then become successful companies from someone else, but I really wanted to focus on the biggest idea, and my angel investors encouraged me that the biggest opportunity was the newswire, which I agreed. There's a company called Harrow right now where we're doing something similar. That sold for several $million. There's 3 or 4 things that I started that we decided to kill off to be able to focus on the newswire, that other people have done similar things since then, and they've become a successful business, but none the size of the newswire. Which today MarketWire is, does over $100 million in revenue, could probably be sold for $300 or $400 million. So the genesis for MarketWire was, like a lot of entrepreneurs, looking to solve a real world problem. So I was running a tech PR firm, and I was finding that my clients that want to get into the same media as, say, a lot of brick and mortar, retail accounts or something. If I was representing Coca-Cola, they'd want to get in a different place than a tech company that wanted to be in this new wave of companies that were, of publications that were like PC Magazine and PC World and Omni. And these were not daily newspapers, these were not local TV stations. Business Wire and PR Newswire, who invented the concept of the press release newswire, they were technology evolution, to make a little detour. PR Newswire, which will be celebrating its 60th anniversary this next year. They actually, I was just at the PRSA in Philadelphia last week. They're already celebrating and making a year-long celebration. But PR Newswire was started by a gentleman, Herbert Michel, who died in 2003 at the age of 90-something. PR people seem to live a long time, which is a nice thing. The father of PR.
Not the ones from LA, apparently.
Well, the cocaine.
That was advertising. That's different.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
And he's still alive.
Yeah. Oh.
In fact, he lives in Canada now. I don't know what that means, but at any rate, where was I with that story?
So you were talking about PR Newswire and the
Yes, Herbert Michel. So the founder, he started two companies. One was TV Guide, and he sold it to the Annenbergs. And the other one was PR Newswire. And PR Newswire, he just thought, gee, there's got to be a better way of getting a hot story to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and all at once. And so he used the modern technology in 1954 of Western Union, telegraph. And what he would do is he would go and send the telegraph out to all the top publications, which had started out with only about a dozen, giving the headlines of the day. And if anybody was interested in the headline, they would then call the company and say, send me, wire me the full press release. And that saved them the work of wiring the place that really weren't interested in the story. And that's how the Newswire was built. They actually sold the company to Western Union.
Mm.
And then it got sold again, and now it's owned by a British concern called, a media company called UBM, Business Media. So Business Wire started in San Francisco in 1961 by a gentleman, Laurie Loke, who's in his 90s and still alive. Again, PR longevity. The father of PR, I was about to say, Eddie de Bernays, lived to be 104. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he coined the term PR. Laurie said, kind of crazy to be like, sending these telegrams. You got to retype them and this and that. And most of the big newspapers and TV stations have the Associated Press satellite service. Why don't I make a deal with it? He actually worked with UPI as a cub reporter, and UPI wasn't interested in, dirtying its hands with press releases, but AP said, well, for the right price, we would consider putting it in our spam box. And so he made a deal with the Associated Press, which went to 600 places, to basically have a press release channel that they would charge him roughly about $100 a release, and he would charge $1,000. And that was his business. He would mark it up, and they charged him by sort of size of the file. So he broke it up into charging by the number of words, which is the genesis of this. You pay for the first 400 words, and you pay extra for that everybody does now. Even though there's no reason anymore for it, nobody charges anybody by the word. Even AP does their feed now via the internet. So I looked, and that was in 1961, and so the press release business, Newswire business, was a very small business from, the 60s through the 70s and into the early 80s. Herbert Michel and Laurie Loke were actually the only employees, full-time employees of the firms. They took the business, they keyed in the stuff, they sent out the bills. I mean, they were chief cook and bottle washer. Herbert was in a brownstone in Manhattan, and Laurie was in San Francisco. And they also eventually resold each other's services. Laurie would concentrate on West Coast distribution as well as West Coast clients, and Herbert would concentrate on East Coast. But they were maybe $1 million a year businesses, and pretty small. Because for the most part, only big companies used them when they had really important news. that was worth spending $1,000 to go and get things, via
Mhm.
telegraph and then via satellite to these top places. And if they didn't write about it, it was basically just seen by nobody.
So what was your innovation?
The internet.
Right.
So, in the 80s, they actually both stumbled upon the fax machine, and that's how they got to other places. So that actually turned out to be a huge growth for the industry, because they could then go to places that didn't have a satellite feed. But the problem was that tech publications didn't want to get a satellite because they're not part of the Associated Press, but they also didn't want to retype the press release. And so literally I had tech reporter after tech reporter tell me when I was giving the news on one of our clients, Fujitsu or whoever, please don't use PR Newswire or BusinessWire, we have to retype it, just email it to me. And so that's where the idea for Internet Wire at the time was originally called, came from, to go and do an internet-based only service, primarily to tech publications that didn't have satellite.
Right.
And had the idea in '92, worked on building it in '93, then launched it in '94.
And how quickly did it grow?
It grew pretty quickly. I was able to get 30,000 journalists in the first year to subscribe,
Right.
and 800 companies. And that was with me and one employee, and then we sort of, had like a grad student from Turkey that was our, it was total bootstrap mode. I mean.
So was there a point, we talked a little bit about that journey or that deal today, but was there a point where you thought, okay, this is going to be a life-changing event, or was it even through the financing and the growth always like, wow, like this is, I'm not sure where this is going to be 6 months from now?
I wasn't sure how fast it was going to grow to the point that I actually, probably didn't spend enough time on it. I mean, it took from '94 to '98 before I actually went out to raise any money, which was too long. The timing was good that I got a big valuation, but the timing was bad in that the crash happened really earlier. If I had raised my angel money a year earlier, we probably would have gotten out and been public, and then, I think been able to sustain a decent valuation just based on revenues. So, market timing is everything, and I'm very cautious of market timing now. I was looking at other opportunities because I also was a partner in the first crowdfunding company, Direct IPO, which I didn't really do too much with other than kind of the marketing of it. And I had them sort of, posted out of the back of my office. I had a 5,000 square foot office overlooking the boats, Marina Del Rey. And so I had like one little wing with MarketWire going, and I had one little wing with Direct IPO going, and then the real money was being brought in by the PR firm.
So a 30-year-old founder or a 25-year-old founder today that is on a similar growth trajectory, if you're that person, do you take Sequoia's money again? Do you take venture capital, or would you go a different route?
Oh, well, we're not to venture capital yet. I would first of all say the 25-year-old founder, if you got a lot of ideas, just really do a good analysis and put most of your time in the one you think's got the biggest upside, and and then maybe just really, they say fail fast, right? Just push it until you see whether it's really going to hit trajectory or not, and if it doesn't, then go to the second biggest one, rather than, I think I made the mistake of trying to do 3 or 4 things at once. Of course, I'm doing that now too, but at least now I'm a little bit more mature, and I'm more like chairman of certain things and advisor to things, and that's fine, but I was trying to be CEO of a couple different companies, and that's kind of hard to do.
Okay, same question. Do you take the VC, or do you,
Well, I took angel money first.
Right.
And then I took VC money. I think in that era, I would have taken the money again, but I would have probably not have taken as much. Because I was only looking for, I got $1 million in angel money, and that took me from $10,000 a month to $100,000 a month. And because, wow, I was actually allowed to lose money for once, instead of just having to be profitable every month. So I was able to invest in extra salespeople who would be profitable for a few months. I was able to invest in certain things that would have a 1 year return instead of like a 1 week return or a 1 payroll period return. And then I was looking for $3 million to be able to go and grow to the next level. And literally, because it was 1999, nobody would give you that little money. They're like, well, we want to put more money to work.
Right.
So I got an offer from Humber Winblad to put $8 million in, and I took it. And then I had my VCs my angels sort of like encouraged me to talk to Sequoia. And Sequoia said, well, dump them and take me. And it's like, no, I want Ann on the board and blah, blah, blah. And so I took twice as much money.
And you want Ann on the board?
Ann Windblad from Windblad.
Right.
And she was great. And
How many
then,
people know who Ann is? Yeah, look her up.
yeah, Ann Windblad is, very powerful VC and just really, chairs the media conference at Davos every year, and was also Bill Gates' girlfriend for 5 years. She started a software company she sold when she was 24 years old, and then just traveled around a lot and dated Bill Gates, and then started a venture fund. It was actually the first software.
She was on your board?
She was on my board, yeah.
Right.
And was actually very helpful board member. The best thing a board member can say to you, someone who's as connected as Ann Windblad, is, okay, I know you need to make deals to make this company work. Give me a list of everyone you want to make a deal with. I don't care if it's the Pope, and I will make the introduction. And I did, and she did.
How many people here have a startup? How many people here have a Bitcoin-related startup? Okay.
So about 80% of the room is startups, and maybe 4 people are Bitcoin. That's fine.
Right.
How many people in the room who have a startup, but if it bought Bitcoin? Okay, I think actually less people have bought Bitcoin than have a startup bought Bitcoin.
About the same, yeah. Okay, so if you have a question related to your, getting your startup going, financing your startup, please, lock and load. You're going to get your shot here in a second.
So the question again that I artfully dodged or whatever, would I take the money again? It depends on the time of market. I think it was good to take the money back then. I probably shouldn't have taken as much. Today, I think that you don't need as much money, depending on what you're trying to do. Obviously, with like Bitcoin, I think it was smart for places like Circle to take $9 million because they may need it all in legal fees.
Right.
So.
Okay.
Why is that?
Circle? Well, Bitcoin, if you're trying to do business in the United States, which is what Circle Financial is trying to do, they're probably going to have a lot of legal issues because it's probably going to follow the path that PayPal did, which needed a lot of money to pay legal fees, to pay state fines. Literally 49 of the 50 states in the US sued PayPal. And they paid several $1 million in fines because they weren't able to guess magically what the states were thinking. And the states that if you're thinking wrong, say, oh, you violated the way we interpret this law, please pay a fine or go to jail.
We did a little piece together that we released over the last couple of days, and one of the things that you said in that was that you saw this movie before, you saw the introduction of the internet and when it happened, and then the wave of social media. So what is it that you see about those emergent trends and the emergence of Bitcoin that make you feel like this is something that we should be engaged in?
Well, in 1993 is when I sort of really, drank the Kool-Aid on the internet. I mean, I pretty much saw that it was going to just change every aspect of business. And I mean, a lot of people were just naysaying. They're going, no. E-commerce isn't going to work because everybody's on mainframe computers, and they don't integrate with the internet, and the big guys will kill more. Brick and mortar companies are going to prevail. And of course, they all felt justified when the dot-coms went under. It's like, revenge of the empire. The internet is dead. I literally had people say, well, that was a nice experiment. And I remember people were saying when internet advertising went from like 0 in 1995 to 11 billion in 2000, and then it dipped down in 2001 to about like 8 or 9 billion, and they were going, well, it's going back to 0 again. We'll never see $11 billion in internet advertising again. No, you won't. Today it's about 150 million or something like that. So yeah, it's things don't happen as fast as you think, but they often have a more profound impact over the long run, and I think that's going to be the case with Bitcoin too. So the second time that I saw something that said like, oh my God, this is going to change the world was social media. When I saw what I considered to be the first, social network that showed the real potential, and it's a very small network that's still around, but it never took off. It's called Rise, R-Y-Z-E. It was sort of combined a lot of the same aspects of what MySpace did as well as what Facebook did. And it was something where it was kind of the next evolution of what communities like GeoCities were in the 90s. We represented Zoom, which was a big competitor of GeoCities back then. And it basically just had a thing that were called your rooms, and you put on your room, you'd say, okay, this is what I have, this is what I want. And it was very open-ended, so it could be business or personal. It could be, I have a nice car, I want a girlfriend. You know, I have a business and I want new clients. And I thought it was very successful as sort of a hybrid business and personal, because I got 4 new clients out of this service in the first 6 months I was on, and a couple of new girlfriends. So I thought that was great, and they actually had their business model tended to be wrong for growth, but it was right for the guy who started it. He basically had a freemium model where you can get a certain amount of information for free, and then $10 a month thereafter. And he never adopted when MySpace made everything free, when Facebook made everything free, and I think they're still around, but you know, I stopped paying a long time ago. But I saw where that was going to go. I was then a beta tester for MySpace. You know, I met Mark Zuckerberg when he launched in 2006. And so I would just sort of watch this going. And when I sold MarketWire in 2006, I was like, okay, what's my next act? And I was like, if starting an internet-based press release service, which was sort of the biggest part of the PR infrastructure in the 90s, was a good idea. What's the good idea for the PR industry and marketing industry overall in the 2000s? And I really looked and saw social media was going to grow exponentially, and it did, triple digits every year. And you know, we're one of the 2 or 3 oldest social media agencies in North America, possibly the world. And then earlier this year, when I saw Bitcoin, I saw that movie running again, and I just saw that this could, you know, be, you know, the start of a wave as big as the internet or social media.
Anybody have a question? Go ahead.
Earlier in your career, when you were saying you had like 2, 3 things going on at the same time, I'm just trying to figure out how did you, I know you didn't have that much experience at that time, but how did you manage to channelize your all energies on one and focus on one thing rather than just basically going all over that?
Well, that's a good question. How to focus on one thing when you have multiple things going on. I guess you focus on one thing at a time, and then you sort of like let the other things see if they kind of sprout. I mean, this we do with an incubator. You know, direct IPO was a huge opportunity, but way too much regulatory. And I was a partner there, so I was the CEO. So I was providing the office space and the marketing, and I think they actually made the mistake, we made the mistake of being too cautious with the regulators. Because we had a competitor that launched that exact same day, April 2nd of 1996, called Wit Capital, that raised $70 million, and it got sold to E-Trade, which then buried them. We raised a couple $100,000, and we spent it all on lawyers. And you know, we had a couple of deals that the founders wanted to do it, which back then, this is before the Jobs Act, we were looking to take companies public through Reg Ds, and you had to go state by state for approval. And we had one company, and a couple companies that were interested, and their angel investors, or in one case their VC, that did not put a lot of money but had the right to reject, rejected it. And so I had all 3 founders of a company that was called 411 interested in going public through us to raise $5 million on a $25 million valuation. Their prior round had been, I think, a couple $100,000 on like a $2 million valuation, so it was a huge uptick. And their VC was Draper Jervison. And they just said, I like the idea, but it's too risky. Tim Draper actually was for it. Fisher was against it, and we didn't get to do it. And the company sold for $90 million to Yahoo 6 months later.
So I guess basically you just do a cost-benefit analysis and just go with your gut at that time.
Yeah, you just sort of, you know, if you got a couple things, just get it to a point where you can test it, see if it's really keeping your attention and has more solutions than problems coming up, or the problems look like they're not going to be, you know. I think with that case, I probably should have just, you know, kind of cut bait on it when I realized it was going to be sort of what it was. And I think, you know, like I said, fail fast is something that I learned, you know, the hard way, but I try to do now.
Because it takes a lot of energy to basically manage all the three things at the same
Right,
time.
and I wasn't managing all three of them. In fact, I was managing the agency. I had someone else sort of as head of operations, even though I was CEO of Internet Wire. And then when I decided that Internet Wire was a bigger opportunity, I actually flipped it and hired someone else who was underneath me to run the PR firm and became full-time CEO of Internet Wire. And that's when it really took off, when I put my full attention to it.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
What percentage did you give up at each stage, and how did you decide how much to give up?
Well, it's what the market demands and what I mean, or allows, and you know, what you're comfortable with in terms of, you know, I mean, Steve Case became a billionaire owning 4% of America Online. So I wanted to make sure that I didn't own 100% of nothing. But I still wanted to maintain control as long as possible. I ended up at the angel round, I gave up, I think it was 20%. I raised, no, not even. I raised $1 million on an $8 million valuation. So it was 1/8, so what is it, about 16% or something? And then I also did
That's late 90s.
this is 98.
98,
Yeah. Well, we had revenues, and we had, at that time, about 1,500 customers.
So is, you know, we compare a lot, there's a lot of comparison between the bubbles, or there may not be a bubble now. So do you think that kind of valuation can be achieved in the Valley right now?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um,
And outside, I mean, you're doing deals outside, like
well, I
what's
mean,
the?
you take an example of a company like one of our one of our board members at BitAngels is Vinny Lingam from Gift. So Gift just raised $5 million on about a $20 million valuation, and they're doing about, I think, $300,000 a month. But that's in gross network proceeds,
Right.
so their
So they
profit
really
is
do
like,
transactional, right?
the transactional is almost zero.
Yeah.
So, I would argue that we probably had, you know, more, we certainly had more profit.
Right.
And we probably had more, you know, kind of traction, and they, you know, because they're in a hot space that they seem to have traction in. You know, if you're in a hot area, you can get a higher valuation. Also, if you're in Silicon Valley, you can basically get double the valuation of anywhere else in the country for the exact same metrics.
Do you think everybody in this room should own Bitcoins?
I think everybody in this room should look and see if owning Bitcoins is right for them. I think that it's a no-brainer in terms of being part of a balanced portfolio as your risk factor, because, you know, the downside is 100%, and the upside is, you know, more than 1,000%, potentially 100,000%. You can't say that about Facebook.
Right. Go ahead.
Nope, I was just gonna say, I'm not sure if there's still a special place in your heart for journalism, but I'm just wondering whether, do you see an intersection between Bitcoin and journalism, the future of journalism, or even just the future of journalism?
Well, I still blog, and I, you know, had a piece, if you want to Google my name, in VentureBeat, where I was talking about what can really raise the value of Bitcoin and what can tank it. And I had like 6 or 7 scenarios for each, so that was, you know, a blog post I did, fairly lengthy one. But yes, I think that Bitcoin as a microtransaction payment is something that will allow people to go and, I mean, you can still today go and, just like Wikipedia, put a little tip jar on your page, and people may or may not go and pay you through a paywall for an article. Bitcoin's not magic. If they didn't pay you before, they probably won't pay you now. If they paid you before, they probably will at least consider that as one of the things. And if somebody who's interested in Bitcoins, they'll probably be more likely to pay you. So the most successful journalists who get paid in Bitcoins are writing about Bitcoins. Yes?
So there's this concept, it's anti-fragile, so it's the opposite of what fragile would be. Some people might think that would be durable, but actually, like, when you look back and analyze emerging technologies, especially disruptive ones, that are the target of regulatory bodies, where they can crack down on, basically, you see companies get destroyed, and then new ones pop up in their place, maybe 10 times as many as were originally being attacked, and they have features that make them resilient to that new round of attacks. So it's like Napster and then like LimeWire and then Kazaa, and they were all progressively more difficult to destroy. And that sort of thing happened over the last like 20 years with virtual currencies, 25 years. And there's been a number of iterations, and people see Bitcoin as being the most recent one, and it's got all these really cool features. My suspicion is that it's past that threshold that kind of makes it almost impossible to destroy, but I'm interested to see where you
Sure.
think.
So, first of all, I would distinguish that I don't believe Bitcoin is a virtual currency, I believe it's a digital currency. The way that I differentiate the two is a virtual currency is something that acts like a currency in another environment. So most of the virtual currencies, and we had a number of virtual currency companies as clients for the last 10 years, 15 almost, is that a virtual currency is like trading weapons inside of World of Warcraft. You can go and then cash that out, but you're still, the value is what the weapon is worth within the video game. If all of a sudden World of Warcraft, it goes out of favor and Blizzard doesn't make any updates, then all of a sudden the weapon value goes down. Bitcoin isn't trying to be like a currency, it's trying to be a currency. And so I don't think anybody has really had anything close to this in terms of market adoption. I mean, it's $2 billion worth of stored value. And I think that for the most part what you're saying is true, and I think it'll continue to happen in Bitcoin with the companies built on it, but Bitcoin itself is not a company. So you can have several, if Coinbase could go crashing down and be shut down by the US government, and then another Coinbase clone that for some reason they like better survives.
Just consider there's Ripple, for example, right? And that was
Ripple is a competitor to Bitcoin, so that's not built on Bitcoin.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
So I would say, would you say that one of them might have the model that would survive? Or
I think Ripple will not survive, because Ripple is a private company. And if you find really, really big things that change the whole playing field, Linux, internet, they weren't owned by one company, they were open source. Bitcoin is open source, or at least open community. The one exception is Facebook. Facebook is owned by a private company, and it's become almost de facto accepted as a standard. That's when you make incredible wealth, is when you're able to go and have a privately held concern treated by everybody as water. Microsoft had that for software for a long time. Facebook has that for social media. Twitter's trying to get there for real-time social media, and that's an incredibly rare and valuable thing to have. I don't think Ripple has it. Yes?
So Ripple is open source, right?
No. Ripple is, has some aspects of open source, but for the most part is still owned by the founders to a much larger degree than what Satoshi has is.
Right, so Ripple client is open source, Ripple server is open source, and they cannot produce more than 100 billion Ripples, right?
Right.
XRPs.
Yep.
And they can't change that. So the control of the XRPs is not owned by the private company. Of course, they own the XRPs, but they can't change the number of XRPs per se.
Yep.
So it is.
It's got some aspects of open source, but it's just, I just think it's dead on arrival.
Sorry, my original question was different, which is, I do understand the difference between math-based currencies and virtual currencies.
Yep.
Bitcoin is primarily a math-based currency.
Right.
And I do see the value that you were putting to it. Now, the math-based currencies, just like virtual currencies, they do have an interface with the real world, which is the conventional banking system. What if one simple regulation bars the conversion from the conventional banking system to the math-based currency system? Isn't that would literally kill Bitcoin? Or
No, because first of all, you'd have to have every country in the world ban it. And then you'd also have to, then you would still be left with people who already have Bitcoins, trading Bitcoins with each other. It would put a big crimp in it, so that is a risk. If every country in the world basically bans it, I don't see that happening.
That's a good point.
Go ahead.
To go back to your comment about fail fast, would you agree that the fail fast is basically a bell curve? If you're not failing enough, it's zero. If you're failing too much, in terms of the effectiveness of what you're learning, basically, it has to probably follow a bell curve, right?
I haven't really studied it, but for the most part, if you fail fast and you think you've done something intelligent and it still fails fast, you basically disproven your model, or you're scared off by the first set of data you see. Sometimes though, the first set of data you see, you just need to push through it to then see a solution further down. So, that's sort of the secret sauce of being an entrepreneur, is how much of it is, stick to it-iveness because you're this close to finding, the answer to the light bulb, versus banging your head against the wall for something that'll never be solved.
Great.
I have a question about Bitcoin in
Yep.
particular. The consumer to consumer or the business to the B2C market for Bitcoin seems intuitive to me, but I'm quite interested to hear what you think. There's a market, will Bitcoin be prevalent in B2B as well? And is that a bigger market?
I
or
think
smaller?
certain aspects of B2B, I think the big opportunity that has largely been untapped and really even unexperimented with is international commerce. So B2B commerce between, countries that have tariffs and that have, are bogged down with currency exchange rates. And you get so many fees layered on if you're going and, buying parts in China and then putting it together with something in Russia and then shipping it to Brazil, and then, by the time you add up all these different currency things, if you do the entire end-to-end supply chain in Bitcoin, that would be a huge thing.
Okay, if you came here to learn something and you haven't had a chance to answer your question, line it up. We've got about 10 minutes. We have a question here.
Yeah, I have two questions. First is, what did you do early in your career when you had too much to do and no money to pay?
I think you still do these things, right?
Well, first of all,
Go ahead.
that's the benefit of being very young, is that you don't have like family responsibilities ideally, unless you got married really young, and you shouldn't get married really young and be an entrepreneur at the same time. Bill Gates once, I met Bill Gates on a number of occasions. And one time, someone had asked him in a cocktail party environment, what do you think the number one reason why you were able to create Microsoft was? And he said, simple, it's because I was 19 when I started it. I could not have created Microsoft if I started at 30. No way. And, I think that it's...
How old were you when you started Marketwire?
I was older.
Right.
But it's not
And
Microsoft size.
actually, no, but statistically, it's actually older founders, right? But
Well, if you look
but
at
on the
really
front page
big,
of the
if you look
blog,
at the really
it's the
big...
young founder.
Yeah, if you look at some of the biggest success stories of our time, 19 pops up a lot.
Right.
That's how old Mark Zuckerberg was, that's how old Tony Hsieh was, that's how old Michael Dell was. If you're fortunate enough to be single-minded and focused and just, I am going to change the world. And, to go back to Bill Gates, here's a guy who basically dropped out of Harvard because he read a magazine article in Popular Science, or Popular Electronics, about the first kit computer, and said, oh my God, this is going to change the world. I have to drop out of Harvard and move to Albuquerque and find out about this. That's the passion that
Most
creates-
19-year-olds are single-minded and focused, and they're going to do something tonight.
Yeah. And, it's a little bit of an obsession that creates that kind of outsized success.
Right.
It's a pretty common theme.
There was a question back. Oh, sorry, you had a second.
Yeah, my second question is, I did quite a bit of research about Bitcoin, and I was thinking about manufacturing some Bitcoins. Do you know anything about that?
You're talking about physical
Mining?
coins?
Mining Bitcoins.
Oh, mining Bitcoins.
And I did quite a bit of research about that. I know you have to use your GPU to do that rather than your CPU.
Correct.
They made a parallelism saying that your CPU is about a small number of people in an office who are very, very intelligent, whereas a GPU is like a lot of people having a big department, but they're kind of stupid.
So most of the bright people that I know in the Bitcoin space have basically said, if you're like one person, you can't make money mining Bitcoin anymore. It's too late. You could have made a ton of it a year ago. But right now, it's this arms race where you have to be sort of the first people to pre-order and get the big shipments of the first range. The people who put in the most money typically are going to get the first range. And if they're buying 20 Jupiters from KNC, and you have a couple of degradations of sort of the difficulty curve. You typically are going to make most of your money that you're ever going to make on the machine in the first week and a half. So if your machine ships late, you may never make your money back.
Go ahead.
Like since we're talking a little bit about the late 1990s and like one of your venture like startups and ideas, I was just wondering if you have any good stories from the dot-com bubble that are still going hard today. That might be about late bloomer entrepreneurs.
I got a lot of good stories from the 90s, some of which I can tell against the company. So I'm sorry, what
This is on video.
Yeah, I know. What aspect of the 90s did he want to know about?
So I guess he wants to know, like, we always hear the flame out, but we're talking about the survival story, right? I mean, Marketwire.
Marketwire, yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of flame outs, but there was also, I mean, the survival stories were usually the ones that did go and rent the helicopters and have the big parties, and Den and Pseudo are two of the classic flame out stories. They both were trying to become what essentially YouTube is today, or at least the YouTube creator network. Digital Entertainment Network was started by Brock Pierce, who is now into Bitcoins, and was into virtual currency. When he was 18 years old, he raised $85 million for Digital Entertainment Network, along with two other people. And they spent that and more in about 2 years.
Right.
And man, they threw
Did they have any fun?
They had way too much fun. And I went to a lot of the Pseudo parties, because Pseudo was Josh Harris, who was the founder of Jupiter, that was a client of ours. And I remember going to a party at the Rosewood Ballroom in New York. I'm not even sure what the reason was, but they spent a mint on this party. And they basically had teepees set up in the middle of the Rosewood Ballroom, which is a fancy New York ballroom. And they had people smoking pot inside of the teepees. They had these pneumatic lifts, and they had basically a couple of the pneumatic lifts that they rented for the party at the top with naked women strapped to them. And you would then go to the top of the thing to see the art project of the naked women there at different angles from the pneumatic lift. That was their party.
So when you're evaluating as an investor, and you're evaluating a Bitcoin startup, and it's, in my mind, we're not looking at a breakthrough innovation. We're looking at something like the Groupon for Bitcoin, or the gift card company for Bitcoin, or, so there's not, like, that's not a breakthrough innovation. It's just like, okay, well, we're going to do this for Bitcoin, and we're going to, be $1 billion company. How do you evaluate a startup that's really looks like it's doing something that's been done, but it's doing it on Bitcoin?
Well, I think you evaluate a startup in Bitcoin the way you evaluate any startup. What's the size of the market opportunity? What's the management team? What's their domain expertise? Do they have some unfair advantage over the competitors? So yes, there's going to be a couple of successful exchange companies, and at least one or two that are going to be huge, and the rest are going to be also rans or crushed or whatever. What makes them in this huge winner-take-most environment have the ability to do this? So you look at Circle. Gee, they've got the guys behind Facebook. They're not going to run out of money. They put $9 million in the first round. You got Jeremy Allaire as the guy who basically, his last two companies were huge successes, an IPO and a big sale. He's running it, okay? You got a good management thing there. He can still fail, because again, maybe what he did in the video B2B space is not going to be comparable to what he's trying to do in the Bitcoin B2C space. And maybe a scrappier company like one of the ones we founded, GoCoin, that actually has Brock Pierce as a chairman, who's been in this market for a long time, knows a lot of the people who are currently buying Bitcoins, is going to be able to get them to switch because of just relationship capital, might have a better opportunity. So, those are the things you look at. What unfair but legal advantage do you have to win the battle?
Okay, over here.
Yeah, two questions. So at the consumer level, I don't know if it's too early or not beginning to know, you seeing any similarities or patterns in the profile of people that are actually using Bitcoins?
The people who are buying them, or the people who are using them?
Using them.
Using them. evangelist, early adopter, techie. You know, most of the people who are using them also are buying them. But their theory is that the only way that it goes up is if you get everybody to use them as well. And, you know, there are some people who are, quote, hoarding them, but from my perspective, whatever amount you're gonna hoard, you still should buy them to use. Because you're just buying them as cash and then use it for a place that takes bitcoins.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking, just on the use side.
Yeah, it's still really early. I mean, I was on a panel in LA with someone from BitPay, and they asked, so what restaurants, because she was basically appointed to be the head of BitPay sales outreach for Southern California, and they said, well, what restaurants in Southern California? This is a place with 30 million people and considered to be a fairly with it, groundbreaking place. What restaurants in Southern California are using Bitcoin? And she's like, well, there aren't any right now. That's early. I mean, literally there's a site that lists every single place that accepts Bitcoin. Could you imagine if there was a site that had every place that accepted PayPal? So we're still at the place you can take every single place that accepts Bitcoin and put it on, you know, a long scrolling page on the internet. That won't be the case a year from now.
Okay, so second question, so what portions of transactions do you want to see in a startup to consider it, let's say, Bitcoin friendly for you to invest in?
Oh, that's got to be the focus of the company. So we're not investing in something that just has sort of like, you know,
Half and
oh, and we
half?
do Bitcoin too. You know, we're actually a chip company, but we're going to do Bitcoin as part of what
Well,
we
I'm
do.
not saying like, let's say like 2%, but
Yeah.
is 50-50 considered Bitcoin friendly or no?
You know, I mean, we looked at participating in the most recent round of Gift, and Gift is only about 50-50, and so we'd consider that to be a Bitcoin-related company, yeah.
Over here?
If you were established and you're only looking for $1 million, where would you find companies that operate at that level?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Right? If you're already an established company, but you're only looking for $1 million, one of the feedbacks I've had is people are looking to invest 9 and 10 million.
Oh, no. That's not true. The big VCs, the big private equity companies, but angels, we work with, I'm putting my PR hat on, we probably announce companies raising $1 million in funding every week. I mean, $1 million is sort of just a decent size.
I think the average size is $600,000
Right.
in Canada
Yeah.
for an early seed.
So from this point forward, what's the next step for me? What do I do?
I don't know what your
I think you
business
need to retain an advisor.
is. I don't know what your business is.
I know one. No, but can we take that offline though? We'll follow up with that. Last question. Go ahead.
So, given that you're a startup company, what kind of capital would you allocate towards Bitcoin versus hard cash for your vendors, partners, business deals? So let's say you're a startup company and you want to pay your employees, and you're somehow able to attract employees who are willing to take Bitcoins.
So you're talking about being a Bitcoin company, not just a startup company.
That's correct. And what percentage would you, in your recommendation, would be a safe one towards allocating cash versus, given that you have raised some amount of capital? Let's say.
Well, the nice thing is that you can convert cash into Bitcoin and Bitcoin into cash, right? So, you know, you don't have to have employees, nor would you expect most employees to take Bitcoin. It's nice if you can get some people to take Bitcoin, and those are typically going to be more advisors. They're not going to usually be, you know, sort of rank and file, but if you end up, like, say, getting funded by BitAngels and Bitcoins, you can convert as much as you want of that to cash, either now, or you could say, I think I'll wait until I need it because, you know, price of Bitcoin on Friday was 204, and today it's 225. Now, again, you're taking a little bit of risk because it might be 125 next week.
Last question.
Just not Bitcoin related, but entrepreneurial related. So when you're getting angel financing or VC financing, you have a preference one over the other, and the second question is, how do you control what the VCs want you to do as opposed to you're the founder and you have your vision?
Angel funding all day long. The only reason you need VC funding is you're raising a huge amount of money, you need it fast, and you're going after just some mind-blowing opportunity where you really want to carry a big stick. I was going against entrenched industry giants who basically had a Coke and Pepsi relationship for the better part of 40 years. And I was at 0% market share, and they were both aggressively trying to put us out of business. And so I needed a big stick. I got a certain, length of the way from angel funding, but I didn't get the strategic relationships that I got from particularly Hummer Windblad. I mean, Sequoia, I was actually hoping that they were going to add some strategic relationships, particularly when I was trying to craft a very complex deal with Yahoo for distribution. And Sequoia was of no help whatsoever because they owned so much of them, they didn't want to interfere because that was their bigger priority, was the ownership stake they had there. On the other hand, Ann Windblad at one board meeting said, "This is crazy. Do you really need Yahoo to get to the next level of sales, level of sales?" And I said, "Yes." She goes, "Great, I'm going to make a call." The next morning, I had a signed contract. Because the guy who was president of Yahoo at the time, not CEO but president, she'd given him his first job. She called in a favor, and we had been negotiating back and forth. They said yes, they would do the deal, but they had other technical priorities for implementing, and it was going to be 6 months to a year, and blah, blah, blah. The terms kept on changing. Had a signed deal, immediate implementation in the morning, and the guy who was in charge of the Yahoo Finance called me and said, "I see you have friends in high places. We're going to do the deal, but we will not be happy about it, and you will know." He was gone to another job a month later, and it was fine. It really
That's network power, right? Network. Okay, so thank you, but last question. Canada emerging as the Bitcoin capital of the universe. What does it take, and why?
It takes Canada to do kind of what Finland has done for certain startups, and what you do to a certain extent in terms of having some government money go toward programs, and just telling people who are developing Bitcoin companies in places like the United States, who's your neighbor, gee, you're having problems with regulators, why don't you go and test things here? I think you're already, kind of communicating that without firmly communicating it, to the point that a Las Vegas company with an innovative technology that could become a huge company, RoboCoin, came here to test it because they were afraid of doing it in their hometown. CoinMarket is also looking at starting in Canada and really test marketing it here because they think there'll be less repercussions. If they don't properly dot the I's and cross the T's, they'll get forgiveness rather than $1 million fines.
Right.
And I think just keep that up and maybe even be proactive about saying to the Canadians, not just for people in America, you want to go and start something, we will really do X, Y, and Z to make sure that Canada becomes one of the most important places in the Bitcoin world. We miss the internet, we miss social media, let's hit it right for Bitcoin.
Michael, we are grateful for you making this trip to Toronto. First of all, though, I would like to thank Rebecca again for this 3-event series. I'd also like to thank, I know Brian's not here, and I think Casey's gone as well, but I really like to thank the team who has supported us so well. Just say hello to Joel, who is the CTO for Startup Growing Globally, who is here with us this evening. Again, though, seriously, I know it's been a long day. The side trip to Waterloo, we're grateful. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this evening.
Thank you.
Cheers.